Hello everyone, Professor Crises here. So I wanted to make another video thinking about Manfred Steger's A Very Short Introduction of Neoliberalism and the concluding chapter that talks about neoliberalism in crisis. So when we look at some of our other readings, we see that authors argue that neoliberal economic ideas have found their way into the public policy making process, that the ideas of efficiency, the ideas of cost-benefit analyses have found their way into the public policy making process. So I think this is an interesting chapter then to spend a few minutes just thinking about and talking about this idea of the crisis of neoliberalism. Maybe something that we encounter in the news, we see in the newspapers, so worthwhile doing a separate video just thinking about this idea. We'll connect these ideas to the larger themes of our course about public policy making, and with the main focus here on how neoliberalism has reshaped policy. Okay, let's dive in. So by the late 1990s, neoliberalism, this policy paradigm, this idea built on free markets, deregulation, the privatization of industry, and of course free trade, had spread across the world. It became so dominant that some began to call it the Washington Consensus. This idea of that you deregulate your market, you come together and join together for free trade, free markets. This idea that the globe will come together as one more unified free market system. Policymakers in Washington, D.C., and in London, and international institutions like the IMF and the World Bank embraced the idea that markets were more efficient than state-led intervention in the markets, and that governments should step back, deregulate, and let competition drive outcomes. But we know that neoliberalism also created some pushbacks, some grievances. It spurred growth in some areas of the economy, in some areas of the world. Yet it also produced deep inequality, instability, and dislocation in other jobs. So regardless of whether we're looking at domestic politics in the US or domestic politics in Bangladesh or international relations, we hear about these issues. We hear people talk about inequality, and we certainly hear people talk in the American context about the dislocation of jobs. We know that's a big driver in some of the populist rhetoric that we hear today on both sides of the political aisle about how jobs are being impacted. Are jobs being shipped overseas? So when we think about what that means, it means that jobs were outsourced, unions were weakened, and social safety nets had to be cut, had to be pulled back. Citizens saw prosperity in some sectors. Some sectors of the economy really benefited from globalization, from this integrated global economy. But other sectors of the economy saw insecurity in their lives, saw their jobs outsourced, saw their jobs being eliminated, saw industries in places like Akron, Ohio, or Toledo, Ohio, or Cleveland, Ohio, or Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or Youngstown, Ohio. In those places, we saw a lot of instability and insecurity in the labor market. So these contradictions laid the groundwork for what Steger describes as the crisis of neoliberalism. So, excuse me. So one major challenge came from social movements and protests. In the late 1990s and the 2000s, we saw the rise of what became known as the global justice movement. The Zapatista uprising in Mexico in 1994 protested NAFTA and the loss of local sovereignty. In 1999, we saw anti-WTO protests in Seattle, Washington, which brought together labor, environmentalists, students, and faith groups in a coalition against corporate globalization. And we watched some of the videos of people in Seattle protesting, demonstrating, speaking out against globalization. We also see more recent phenomenons, people protesting against WTO meetings across the world. So these movements matter because they forced policymakers to confront the fact that economic policy is never neutral. Protesters framed debates around fairness, sustainability, and democracy, values that we've seen from other readings that authors argue that neoliberalism policymaking kind of ignores or says isn't the most important piece of the public policy making process. At the same time, a different kind of backlash came and has emerged. Populist, nationalistic politicians have argued that neoliberal globalization hollowed out communities, destroyed local jobs, and weakened national sovereignty. We've seen figures like Patrick Buchanan in the U.S., the Le Pens in France, and later, who is now in the news, Farage in the UK. All positioned themselves as defenders of the people against both global elites and this free trade orthodoxy, this idea of globalization. So in the 2010s, the right-wing populist backlash grew stronger. We saw during the Donald Trump campaign in 2016 that he talked about tearing up trade deals, bringing jobs back to the U.S. Brexit in 2016 was framed by its supporters as a way of taking back control from neoliberal bureaucracies in Brussels. Here in the U.S. with Donald Trump, he talks about how free trade has taken jobs and that jobs will be brought back and industries will be brought back. This pushback against the neoliberal orthodoxy of international trade, of free trade. So we see this pushback. So by the early 21st century, public policy was being squeezed from both sides. Left-wing movements demanding more justice and sustainability, movements led by like Bernie Sanders from Vermont, who talks about many of these similar things that the Trump administration does, about giving more power to workers, to bringing jobs back, and right-wing populists demanding sovereignty and protectionism to protect jobs. So this isn't just a new phenomenon that emerged in 2016. In 2008, we had the global financial crisis, where deregulated financial institutions, celebrated as engines of innovation, had engaged in what we can now see as kind of some reckless practices. Subprime mortgages, mortgage-backed securities, and credit default swaps. When the housing market bust, the global economy nearly collapsed. Governments that had championed free markets suddenly had no choice but to intervene. They bailed out banks, nationalized failing institutions, and spent trillions in stimulus funds to try to save the economy. In effect, neoliberalism had to be suspended to save the neoliberal system. But here's the irony. When policymakers acknowledged the failures of some of the deregulated, unregulated markets, most reforms were modest. Wall Street recovered pretty quickly, but millions of families lost homes and jobs. Inequalities widened even further. So we see that created some rhetoric for populist elected officials to say neoliberalism isn't working. The free trade system isn't working. So the crisis of 2008 and 2009 kind of shook the faith in neoliberal policymaking, but we know it didn't dismantle it. Instead, neoliberalism adapted and persisted. So, since 2008, when we think of the challenges that neoliberalism has faced, it has faced a series of new challenges. As we brought up this idea of popularization and polarization, politicians like Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, Bolsonaro, Orban have rejected neoliberal globalization while embracing, some of these politicians have embraced nationalism. Bernie Sanders has pushed back and talked about redistributive policies. Maybe less nationalism, but certainly redistributive policies. These competing pressures have destabilized the conventional idea of policymaking through a neoliberal perspective. So, another crisis, a perceived crisis of neoliberalism, is this emerging talk about inequality. Decades of neoliberal policies have actually widened the gap between rich and poor. Public frustration over stagnant wages, frustration over the cost of living is now the pretty defining force in politics that we hear lots of elected officials and want to be elected officials talking about. That there are stagnant wages, that it's getting more and more expensive. So this really shapes debates over taxation and healthcare, shapes this debates over social programs. So we also, and the authors brought up how neoliberal policies, tools like carbon trading, have maybe not proven adequate enough for combating climate change. At least the author says, okay, this idea of a neoliberal policy for solving climate change maybe hasn't gone far enough. And there's a ton of literature that debates over, okay, how do we best combat changing climate? But our author here says the policies rooted in neoliberalism maybe haven't gone far enough. So in each of these areas, we see the same dynamics. Neoliberal policymaking continues to set the terms of the debate, but new crises and new movements are pushing governments to reconsider. So then, what can we say about public policy in the era of neoliberalism? First, neoliberalism has reshaped policymaking by prioritizing markets, efficiency, and deregulation, as we've seen in our reading, as we saw in our video I recorded this earlier this morning. That framework has become the baseline for decades of public policy decision making. Second, this debate over, and we had it in class, is there a debate? Is there a crisis of neoliberalism? So this crisis of neoliberalism that the authors put forward, and as we saw in class, there's different ideas of, okay, is there actually a crisis or not? But the author is saying that yes, there are at least these ways we can look at, okay, these challenges to neoliberalism. Protests, populism, and financial collapses revealed the limitations and vulnerabilities of this approach to policymaking. They showed that policymaking is not just about efficiency, but also about justice, sovereignty, and democracy. And third, modern challenges like inequality, climate change, and digital globalization are pushing policymakers to rethink some old assumptions. But we have seen that from our other readings that many of these ideas of market fundamentalism are rooted in and have burrowed themselves into the policymaking process. So other authors, as we have seen, said, well, this makes it harder to then have big changes in the system because how we teach in school, how we think in think tanks, are still rooted on these fundamentals of neoliberalism and fundamental market principles. So, an interesting debate between our two readings for this week, and throughout the semester, we'll see different angles to these same issues being discussed. Okay, thank you for watching to the end.